On behalf of the director of the ACDH, Karl-Heinz Mörth, who unfortunately could not join us today due to his teaching engagement at university, I would like to welcome you to another edition of the ACDH Lecture series. Today we are happy to welcome Professor Gregory Crane, who will speak about Greek, Latin, the other 19 languages, and the need for a global philology. Our institute was founded with the declared goal of fostering new methods within the humanities, and it was in pursuit of this goal that we established this special ACDH lecture format about 2 years ago. We also hope to inspire the next generation of researchers and particularly welcome our students from the university today. I will now hand over the podium to Tara Andrews, Professor for Digital Humanities at the Vienna University, who will introduce Gregory Crane and moderate the discussion afterwards. I would like to thank all those who were involved in preparing this lecture, especially my team colleagues from Network and Outreach. Enjoy this lecture and feel free to join us for a drink and a conversation afterwards.
Okay, welcome. It's my pleasure today to introduce Professor Gregory Crane, who comes to us today from the University of Leipzig, where he's the Alexander von Humboldt Professor of Digital Humanities. And at the same time, he continues to hold the Winnick Family Chair of Technology and Entrepreneurship at Tufts University in Boston. So he is one of these people who is managing the amazing feat of being 2 places at once, which is very valuable. Professor Crane is perhaps most well known for his co-foundation and his leadership of the Perseus Project, which is also based at Tufts University. This is a long-standing and renowned digital library for Greek and Latin texts particularly, and it includes a collection of invaluable lexical and linguistic resources for students of classical languages, which saved my bacon a number of times when I was a master's student myself. In recent years, he has focused in particular on expanding access to these resources to as broad an audience as possible, and particularly into the developing world. And from the title today, I imagine we might hear even a little bit about that. The Austrian Center for Digital Humanities is particularly excited to welcome Professor Crane to speak to us today, since the ACDH is home to quite a few innovative digital resources for linguistics and lexicography as well. Many colleagues of the Institute have been engaged in corpus projects, doing some research in corpus design, corpus creation, and corpus analysis. They've been working on historical material as well as on contemporary data in projects such as the Austrian Media Corpus, the Tunisian Youth Language, or the MIMAS project, Migration Marktschule. And so an important topic in relation to some of these endeavors has been the corpus to dictionary interface and the creation of lexical information from digital text collections, which is something on which I think Professor Crane will have quite a lot to say. So the ACDH is just now working on its agreement for what it's going to do for the next 3 years, for 2018 to 2020. And text and language is going to be an important cornerstone of its research activities in these years to come. And so with all that in mind, it's my pleasure to welcome Professor Crane.
So, es ist ein großes Vergnügen für mich hier zu sein. Ich hoffe, dass Sie mir verzeihen werden, wenn ich meine Muttersprache benutze. Aber ich meine, dass die meisten von Ihnen, die mich besser auf Englisch verstehen können werden, besonders die Deutschsprachigen. And therefore, the rest in English. It's a real pleasure to be here, to have an opportunity to come here to Vienna for the second time in my life. I took this opportunity, actually, of this lecture to bring my family down the previous week so that we could spend a few days together here in this city. The second, I guess you've edged Hamburg out for second biggest German city, or city in the German-speaking world, so well done. I'll talk today not just about Greek and Latin and the need for global philology, but also about what I call the other 19 languages. And the other 19 languages refer to the 19 EU languages that are not English, French, German, Italian, and Spanish. And much of what I say is really conditioned in a sort of evolutionary way by larger political events in Europe and in the United States, and in the role of scholarship in fashioning a society that is sustainable and functional. I don't know how to do that, but I do recognize the problem. I will point out that my sons stay up a lot later than I do, and they were down in the bar below us on the other side of the canal, breathing secondhand smoke and playing darts with people. At one point, the bartender expressed the great desire that they could bring a little bit of Trump here in Austria. I must say that's not something I hear in Germany. I guess it's a good thing not to be reviled for being American, but it is a different point of view, and a point of view that needs to be understood and internalized and dealt with in an intelligent fashion. Now, I'll begin with just a generic quote, and with a person, an American thinker who worked about 10 miles from my American home in Cambridge, Massachusetts. And I think this really, for me, summarizes partially my goals as a humanist. Nature and human life are as various as our several constitutions. Who shall say what prospect life offers to another? Could a greater miracle take place than for us to look through each other's eyes for an instant? We should live in all the ages of the world in an hour, in all the worlds of the ages, history, poetry, mythology. I know of no reading of another's experiences so startling and informing as this would be. And for me, the view of this 19th century American thinker, most famous for withdrawing partially from industrial society, really captures the values that I see us able to re-implement with the tools of the 21st century. And there's really very little here that I want to do that's not covered in some way by this general statement. I have to say, I've been thinking about Austria, and as I travel through Europe, I try to think about both Europe as a whole, Europe as it works, Europe as it does not work, Europe in its sort of ideal form, and I think I probably like Europe more than any European because I didn't grow up here, and I only see the great historical achievement. I don't see the annoying things from Brussels and so on. And here, I was struck by this caricature in the Herrliches Geschichtliches Museum, Heeresgeschichtliches Museum, outside the city, of a young cadet learning Czech, and at the quavering in front of the big and overbearing professor. And in part, I selected this illustration because Charlie commented to me that nobody learns Czech anymore. But in part because I think the Austrian, my impression, and I'm sure you will probably correct me, but my impression is that the Austrian historical point of view is, of course, different. That's surely the case. But offers really interesting opportunities as a voice within Europe and the world. And a voice that, in fact, can integrate, I hope, anxieties that have caused things that maybe some of us aren't crazy about. And I think that one of the things that strikes me is the far greater depth of engagement historically with the variety of language and culture that you would inherit here. More so, I think, than we have in Germany. Although I did not go through the school system in Germany, I can't speak with any kind of authority on that or anything else. So part of what I'll be thinking about is what the humanities do in nation states. And here are some figures that I pulled together a couple of years ago and that I found very revealing. And they led me to think about to see why the humanities are so different from another point of view, different from other disciplines. And what I discovered when I just looked at the United States and Germany and numbers and so on, it was clear that there were three areas which I would call the big humanities. And I haven't gone through every country. I bet these are going to be the same everywhere. The first is, and I think has to be, the national language or languages. If you're Switzerland, you have multiple languages. Here, you have a language. But you have to defend and advance your national language and your national consciousness as represented in that language. It'd be interesting to understand the relationship between German here and German up north. But it's absolutely essential and non-trivial. Of course, you have to understand the national history, and that's always conceived of as being singular, even if you're in Spain and you're trying to think, if you want to have Spain as a nation state, you have to have complexity within a single entity, and there's a disagreement about that, obviously, right now, the outcome of which is uncertain. And then the third big domain consists of modern languages. In Germany, it's modern languages so we can sell things to everybody, and it's mainly English. In the United States, it's all the foreign languages spoken by people who want to kill us, a growth industry usually. But these are the three things. They're all designed in some fashion. They're there to serve the functioning and evolution of the nation state. Now that's actually not a criticism. That is a statement to some extent that we have to do that. But that's different from biology. It's different from chemistry. It's different from physics. It's different from other disciplines which are fundamentally transnational, where they would be speaking Latin if Napoleon had not started the round of national language imperialism. Actually, it starts in the 18th century. And we ended up, for now, with English. And so the thing I really am thinking about is the role of Greek and Latin and the idea of Europe as a generalizable idea. I think of Greek and Latin as great transnational languages that were used as media of communication that transcended your particular nation state, especially in the Res Publica Literarum, when you have early modern Latin. To use Latin was to state, I am not just a subject of the Elector of Saxony or the King of France. I belong to something larger. And I think this Europe, for me, is in small an attempt to do something to move in the direction that we need, in which we need to move, if we're to exist as a species in the next several hundred years. That doesn't mean it's perfect. It means it's a lot better than what we were doing 71 years ago, obviously. And one of the challenges, though, in Europe is and this is, again, something I did not think about until I moved to Germany. During most of my life, I decided if I could make myself understood in German, French, Italian, and English, still working on English, those the four languages of classical scholarship, I would be set. And I've worked on Arabic, and I've worked a little bit on Mandarin. If I could just speak all these languages, I would be sort of a cosmopolitan person. I'd be able to advance this goal, this larger cosmopolitan goal, effectively. And then I started working with my friends in places like Zagreb, and realized that if you speak Croatian or you speak Latvian, no one virtually will ever hear your voice who is not your fellow citizen. And if you look at statistics for the number of people who speak languages other than their own in the European Union, I have not gotten to the absolute source for this. I got this out of a Wikipedia article which cited an EU report. When I looked up the EU report, I couldn't find this table, but I suspect the figures are accurate. You can see there's a power law here. You have English is the most commonly spoken second language in the European Union. That's why deshalb benutze ich Englisch heute Abend. And English and German and French are like in Anglo-Saxon literature, like Sherlock Holmes and Moriarty, struggling always in eternal conflict. They're always tied side by side and edging each other out. And then we get to Spanish, and then to Italian, or Italian, and then Spanish, and then Italian. And after that, we drop off to 1%, 0%, 1%. How do you run a society where only a minority of the languages have any kind of voice? How do you have people feel that they participate in a larger union if no one will ever understand the words and the language in which you dream or that your mother spoke to you when you were a child? And I think that's a huge issue. We see this EU population without those guys across the English Channel. And you have about 170 million people speak the languages, speak the big 5 languages, including in Austria. And you have, and here is your, remove them. And I've been thinking about different roles. And I just leave this slide in here because I was in Warsaw a couple of weeks ago talking about digital humanities in Poland and what are the possibilities if you're a Polish humanist. And I think if you're a Polish humanist, you speak the largest language by a factor of 2 in Europe that nobody else speaks. And you have an opportunity to be a proponent of, simply a proponent of your own native language or your own native culture, or to see yourself as a proponent of native languages and native cultures. And to see yourself as the natural ally, and perhaps the biggest among many, of languages that are not represented. And I think the challenge of an opportunity of the digital humanities is to do something about this. You cannot address the cognitive limits of the human brain. We're not going to get fluent in 24 languages. But our ability to interact with language is one which has changed, even though we have not realized and effectively implemented those changes. The potential is there. Now I'll point out, you'll all be pleased to see in this measure of cosmopolitanism, Austria is just ahead of Germany. I know that always makes you happy. Would make me happy. Anyway, Finland. But I think society, one question I have is why do we do a lot of the work? Why do we do the corpora, create the corpora? Why do we create historical editions? Why do we do the kinds of things which really typify what happens here also in this institute? And I think that my goal within the digital humanities is to support historical editions as instruments that allow historical sources to play the fullest possible role in the lived intellectual life of humanity, both within the host nation and beyond. This is a very different mindset than the mindset I had when I was in graduate school, where I knew that the only people who would ever read my material were other specialists. And I didn't care about anybody else because I needed to get a job, I needed letters, I needed to network, and these were the people that matter. And it was in part because no one would physically, logistically be able to work with these sources. But I don't believe that anymore. And I think we have a role to play. Okay, so I'll speak a little about global philology and Germany or German, and that's kind of an ambivalent, I'm very conscious of the fact that Germany has a strange kind of role, is by far the biggest German-speaking nation, but it's not the only nation. And so these Germany and German are two related, but not the same thing. But in Germany, we always enjoy pointing out places where we could say, are we the same as those Anglo-Saxons and the Japanese in this case? And it is an article from last year about the collapse of the humanities in Japan, in the United States, in England, and we're all like horrible utilitarians, and everything is collapsing, and all people, nobody's majoring in the humanities anymore, and they just want to get jobs in finance. And how is it in Germany? It's a setup question, of course. In Germany, it's not, they wouldn't write the article if it wasn't better in Germany. And so in the last 10 years, enrollments in the humanities went from 420,000 to 500,000. So to some extent, this is a, yes, we are great, and justifiably so. I always find it a little amusing, charming, I should say. But if we look in another direction, in Germany, the number of professorships between 1999 and 2014 increased by 20%. Good times to be a professor, to be a professor doctor. There are not many of us. It's always a good time to be a professor doctor, I guess. But there are even more of us than there were 20 years ago. But during roughly the same period, from 1997 to 2015, a shorter period of time, the number of Lehrstühle, of chairs in the Fachgruppe Alte Kulturen und Sprachen declined from 200 to about 155. Think about that. The number of chairs are going up. This is not a country with economic crisis. Number of chairs are going up. Number of chairs in historical languages going down. Number of humanist students increasing. But for me, when you cease to value historical languages, it's a bad sign, because historical languages challenge you to think about someone who was not like you. They challenge you not to think, to go beyond your daily experience. And to me, this is very worrisome. And it's not just, it's easy, I'm acutely conscious of the decline of the use of languages other than English in the United States. But even in Germany, I think this is a worrying sign. And it's not so great for other disciplines. We also have, I just say, depressing slides. My discipline is my historical discipline, which is classics, Altertumswissenschaft, klassische Philologie, is the one where German is the most read, but it is in big decline. Again, it's a big issue and a big problem, and a source of disquiet, and I just skip through these depressing slides. The numbers are bad. Numbers have gotten bad. So we spent much of the last year thinking about what we could do about historical languages and languages in general. Also a little bit about what we could do about German, getting more people to be aware of what was happening in German, a subject I care about. The BMBF is the German Ministry for Education and Research. And I went there in January 2016, and I said, I showed these statistics about the collapse of Alte Kulturen und Sprachen. And I know, had I gone to Washington and gone to my senator's office and said, the number of professors of ancient languages has declined precipitously. And I'm sure the staffer would have looked at me and said, oh, you mean we still have chairs of ancient languages? That's more slots for the MINT disciplines, or for the STEM disciplines. But at the ministry in Bonn, they were actually concerned and said, well, this is not a good thing. This is very important for Germany, for German scholarly identity. And they ended up giving us more money for a planning study than we even asked for. I visited them last week, and we'll be coming up with a plan for how to go forward that will be distributed, and that will focus on the use of languages, specifically historical languages. It'll be a German plan, because this is a German ministry, and they do things only in Germany. But it can only work, or it can only work effectively, insofar as it is an international effort. And what we want to do is very similar to what you all are doing here. And this really emerged, and I spent 2.5 hours with Charlie Friday morning. We both lost track of time. We had so much in common. So I'm hoping there'll be interesting things that we can talk about presently. Now, global philology, what do I mean by philology, and there are various interpretations of it. This is a quotation that I heard first when I was 17 years old at university. And Cedric Hubble Whitman quoted it slightly differently. He said, Auguste Burke said that philology is the art of scientia totius antiquitatis. And I found the quote, and I think it's not quite the same thing. It differs in an interesting way. Philology is the universi antiquitatis cognitio historica et philosophica. And to me, this is a really interesting definition. And again, along with the Thoreau quote, transcends technology. It is I understand, it would translate this or paraphrase it as the cognitio, the understanding. And not scientio, which could be in a database. But cognitio is only something that happens when the neurons of a living brain fire. It is lived understanding. And that is a really important distinction. The thing you write to get tenure that no one other than the people reviewing you will ever read, that is not cognitio. Cognitio has an impact in the minds of the human beings. It is like Wilamowitz referring to bringing Blut an die Schatten, the blood that brings the minds of the dead back to life. So it is this understanding of the past in its entirety, universi. Historica, which I take to be everything that happens out in the world, and philosophica, which I take to be anything that happens in the human brain. So intellectual, political history, it is the understanding of the past in its entirety by any means necessary. And this is the non-trivial definition, and the non-triviality appears to me when I'm constantly being told, oh, you do Greek and Latin, and you're also in a department of computer science. Isn't that funny? That's so cute that you do that you would do something so contradictory. And to me, that is not contradictory, because the statement of Burke is unbounded. It doesn't say you use the tools of print. It defines goals, and it challenges us, at least challenges me, to think about any method possible. And if I have to learn machine learning, I'm going to learn machine learning. If I've got to learn something about statistics, I'll do that. If I got to learn how to program, I'll do that too. If I need whatever it takes, that's where I would go. So this is kind of a driving force here. So only this is restates what I just said. And why would you need a global philology, sort of a philology that seeks in an agile way to deal with, in some fashion, the fact that we live in a world where there are still thousands of languages spoken, and even in the EU with 24 languages, the language problem is intractable. I mean, I think someday I'm going to try and get my Lithuanian and my Hungarian going. If anyone can speak like 24 European languages, I don't want to hear about it because you're just going to depress me. All right? But there are really three functions. I would say there's social, political, and economic. There's your nation state in the world. Intellectual, it's just wicked awesome to do it. It's fun. And then pragmatic issues, how do you make this work? And just quickly, it's social and economic context for this. And how do you understand our cultural heritage in Germany or the US or Austria or wherever within an increasingly globalized world where other regions outside of Europe and North America are also economically advanced and technologically capable, and do so without losing hold of your native culture. And I guess I'm like an old-fashioned, I'm sympathetic intellectually to old-fashioned Marxism with like superstructure and infrastructure. You know, where are your exports? Where are you making your money? And this is a good way to see what's driving your society. US exports, you can see the United States is a global, sits in a big island between the Pacific and the Atlantic. And Germany, where I live, is remains a continental power. And you can see it in the way in which it sells things. And Austria is similar in this configuration to Germany, except Austria sells stuff to Germany and Germany sells stuff to France. You don't have this, you have different relationships there. So these are things, when you try to understand what's fundable, what's going to work in your society, what drives things, it's important to bear these material things in mind. But of course, it's not just about trade. It's not just that. And there are issues about population. This is a chart that partially explains Trump's election. And this came out in 2015. And it shows that the United States is actually increasing in population, which I had not realized. And it's increasing in population because it has been because of immigration. We'll see if that keeps going. So this is, and this is a source of pressure and anxiety among some people. In Germany, the population situation is either bad or terrible, depending on which projection you choose. So maintaining our population, and I say our, unsere Bevölkerung, because I'm a permanent resident of Germany. And so how do you maintain an industrial state when you're losing population and not everybody's going to come from Italy? It's a cultural and intellectual challenge to think about how you move forward there. One with all sorts of anxieties as you hear. If I said multiculti in English, I probably would lose tenure. But the sensibilities are a little different. And again, we have economic motivations to figure out how to deal with people who are from a different place. And yet, obviously, it's challenging to do that and not easy. In Austria, it doesn't seem to be quite such a challenge, though maybe it's because you have internalized, you've already got people here, but I see your population is going up, at least not going down, which has implications of various kinds, and of course is varied, and I don't know the details here. But these population demographic issues are clearly central to thought, to culture, and we have a role. We humanists have a central role in this discussion. And I would just say, telling people they're stupid and evil probably is not a very good way to have a conversation because they won't listen to you. And how do you fashion a culture that integrates immigrants culturally as well as economically if you choose to have any immigrants is a big, interesting challenge. To me, make it concrete. I'm in a department of classics in the United States. If you say Greek and Latin equals classics, what am I going to do in 40 years? Well, I won't be here in 40 years. But what will the department do in 40 years when a majority of the population of the United States, at least, does not come from Europe? Is Greek and Latin enough? I don't think so. So the United States has one kind of problem. In Europe, being Eurocentric is not a problem in Europe. Shouldn't be, because it's Europe. But how do we think about these things? Okay. So intellectual motivations for global philology is a little more fun, at least a little less angst-provoking, I hope. And so one thing of which I'm acutely conscious is that we moved into what I would call the long tail world in the humanities. And the long tail is a marketing topic that Chris Anderson, I think, invented 10 years ago. Maybe somebody else came up with it first. But basically, in a print bookshop, you have limited space. And so you focus on bestsellers. And most of your revenue comes from a small number of books, a small number of physical records, a small number in the old days of videotapes, not that they have them anymore. When you have an infinite inventory, when you're Amazon or Netflix or iTunes, and you basically can have everything, you find that half of all of your usage comes from songs or books or movies that only a few people look at individually, but that in the aggregate are immensely important. Half of everything. And in the context of the humanities, we have millions of documents freely available today that nobody has studied, nobody has worked with. How do we work with that? And so, I mean, here's just an example of something that happened to me when I was preparing a talk. I went into YouTube, and I was presented with a symphony by a musician, and I'm afraid if you know this person, I think he's actually Austrian. I had never heard of him. And I listened to the symphony. I never would have gone to look for his music because I didn't know who he was. But I was nudged there. And I thought this is really telling, because this is the first step generically in the kind of world of which we're a part, in which you are presented with a cultural artifact that you would never, I would never have encountered in print culture. And so this is an opportunity, a challenge to say, well, think about this guy. Listen, learn something. And, okay, but then so what? Well, you know, right now, people complain about, I read books about how the internet, you know, smartphones make your brain smaller and so on. It was like when I was a kid, stop watching TV, it'll rot your brain. And Plato said, stop reading, it'll rot your brain too. Information technology. This always has an effect. I mean, right now, you can already muddle along and start figuring out who people are. We do this all the time. And we see already available the primitive beginnings of an environment in which we can, if we so choose, expand our horizons and start to say, well, I've seen this, what am I looking at? And there's a whole bunch of questions that I would like to be able to support. And the last one is maybe the most important. How do I think critically about what I find? There has to be the assumption that there's evidence, that you can go further, that you can make critical analysis. Again, I wrote this slide a while ago, but the importance of this slide to me in the last year has grown, last year and a half, with the American elections and other elections, has grown. It's not academic. Fake news. You have to have a culture that there's data. Now, just in the academy, if you just think about the way we work, this is a reading group, the Stanford Ancient Chinese and Mediterranean Empires Comparative History Project, Ancient Greek, Classical Chinese, Latin, Coptic, Syriac. Again, hardly anybody has mastered all of these languages or will master them. And there's always more languages to go. Or how do you teach? Here was a course taught by my colleague who's now at LMU and her colleague in London, just on Assyrian and Greek conceptions of warfare. Again, nobody had all the languages. Some people knew the cuneiform languages, some people knew the Greek and Latin, or the Greek, or Greco-Arabic culture, a subject dear to my heart. Or simply the question of world literature. And the convention in world literature is we just read everything in English translation, which to me as a philologist is like, don't have a stroke just thinking about it. But I mean, if you're going to read Japanese novels, you're going to read, you know, the stuff from 20 or 30 languages, you have not been able to do, you've had to compromise. But I think, how do we deal with these languages? And I'm going to try not to speak too much longer because I'm getting into the substantive side here. And this, to me, is what's exciting about the digital humanities. And it's this subset of the digital humanities in which I interest myself. And it is the set of technologies that change the way in which we can interact with language. And I'll give you an example of something that's not new. Those of you who are linguists, at least a certain kind of linguists, are accustomed to the idea that you have to work with languages that not only do you not know them fluently, you've never studied them. Because if you're dealing with hundreds of languages, you have to work with things, with many different languages. And the way you do it is you systematically annotate everything intensively. And here we have the Leipzig glossing rules with examples from Lesgian and West Icelandic and so on. So your usual languages that are not French and English. But these methods can be applied to ancient languages as well. In fact, they are being applied to ancient languages as well. Here are my colleagues in Berlin and Göttingen who've started applying this to ancient forms of ancient Egyptian. I've seen it done for cuneiform. And when you intensively annotate the language at this level of depth, then you can immediately start to do something with the language directly. Now, this is a really interesting step because it reflects an intellectual decision or change in mindset, and one that was very difficult for me. I assumed that if you had not studied a language intensively, and if you didn't know the principal parts of Pharaoh, then you were not worthy to read Greek. It was kind of a competitive exercise. And then I started to work with Akkadian and Sumerian and Hittite on top, and nobody can learn Sumerian because there's no grammar. And I realized that if you're really trying to look at large intellectual questions and not focus just on one or a small number of languages, you had to compromise. And this is one mechanism. And there are various projects on this. Here's another one, Rosetta Stone Online. And you can implement this, re-implement this ourselves in different ways. This is data for what's called a tree bank, morphosyntactic data for Greek and Latin texts. You can visualize it like this, ein Baumbank. And because you can visualize the syntactic relationships in a tree format. And if you have this, you have an answer to the question for every single word in a sentence, what is the function of this word? And you have the ability to encode your interpretation of a sentence in a way that other people who have not learned the language could start to interact with the sentence directly. And then if you combine this with another technology which we call, where you align translations and their source texts at the word and phrase level, you have another dimension, which is really obviously language dependent. On the right-hand side, you can see Arabic, and I know you can't read the Arabic, but some of the Arabic words are orange and some are black. The orange Arabic words are words that have that have been judged not to correspond to anything in the Greek. This is an Arabic translation of a Greek text. And even there, visually, even if you know no Arabic, you get an immediate sense that the Greek is pretty well accounted for, but the Arabic has a little bit that's been added to it. And you may well be, as an expert, if you're an expert in Arabic, someone comes up and says, no, I disagree with this interpretation and so on. But this is the visualization of an interpretation of two languages. And even if you don't know Greek and Arabic, you see something about the relationship between translation, text and translation. And if you then flip this around and actually make the links between words and their translations dynamic, then this becomes also a way of reading things. And those of you who've studied Greek and Latin may know about interlinear translations, which are where you do this by hand. In the old days, it's how you passed exams without learning Greek or Latin. But this is a technology that has all sorts of applications, such as being able to search how one word is translated in another language over time. But it also opens up the language in interesting ways. When I teach Greek literature to people who know no Greek language, they work with the Greek language immediately. They're able to understand how two translations relate to the Greek text. They're able to take a word and see what it really means by seeing all the places in the Greek text where it's used. And then all the places, and then figuring out how it's translated, and to see, for example, oh, this word, the word love corresponds to eros in Plato and to agape in the New Testament. And those are different things. And to infer this kind of knowledge. This changes the relationship between the reader and the language, and language in general in a very fundamental way. The challenge here is doing this scalably. The challenge here is doing this for billions and billions of words. And that's, I won't get into that right now, but the concept is creating an environment that constantly makes language something with which you can engage, then educating people so they know what they do and do not get out of this, and then understanding how you go from
looking up every single word to starting to internalize the language so that you can actually read it or engage with it at a higher level. All right. So this was, to summarize this part, this is what I was trained to think about as my intellectual space. It's pretty big, but bigger than I could deal with but this is how I thought about it. Most people probably still think about it. This is how I think about studying the ancient world. How do you think about the entire Silk Road? How do you think about global systems? With print technology, what could you do? You had to read other people's books only. Now we have different ways of interacting with language that are evolving. All right, let me finish up. Looking at this, we have, there's some recurrent core topics. So if you have global philology, if you're trying to systematically support this, I would look at least 7 functions. Transcription, getting something from, material written texts into a machine actionable form. Linguistic annotation, morphology, syntax, named entities, including social network analysis, geospatial analysis, everything that goes with it. Text reuse detection, I haven't even talked about it, but seeing what text quote another. Text mining, getting meaning out of the text. And then front-end user experience analysis, always never emphasized enough. And then finally, what is the effect of all this on reception and learning? These are all, the last 6 and 7 really cut across everything. And these are some things you think about here also. And how do we address this? I hope that we'll get support from the ministry in Bonn to do something with these 7 topics, but we'll never get enough done ourselves in Germany. We'll never get enough done ourselves even in all of Europe. We need to work together. All right. So what are some of the pragmatic issues to finish up? This is a quote from an email I got recently, and I'm going to leave it general, but I think it's great because it was, we started a project, we have our historical language, we thought we would love to work with y'all with Greek and Latin. Then we looked at our language, and our language is so horribly complicated. We couldn't, there's nothing we could do about it. And so we just had to focus on our language, and maybe someday we can work together. And I want to make it clear, I understand that was the right thing to do. But it also speaks to the limitation of the project. You get a few years of work, and you say, oh my God, I've got to do this right. And then what happens is, everybody ends up building their own infrastructures because we have short-term projects and limited money, and so you have to spend the money you have to solve the problems at hand. And then I build an infrastructure for Greek and Latin. It's not good enough for anybody else to use. And so they have to build their own infrastructure, and then theirs isn't good enough for anybody else. And the next project creates its own infrastructure, and I think you can probably guess who this guy is, or maybe this will help. We are trapped where we have not reached this level of scale where we can build on each other's work at the level that we would like. And I will say, I don't want to do any work. I want to use somebody else's infrastructure. And it's hard, but we're not there yet. There are practical issues. And one is that programming, software engineers are expensive. And unless you have the monastic calling and they're willing to work for government rates, and they don't have a mortgage, and they don't have children, they don't have other things in life. Some people, God bless you if you do it. But it's hard to really get professional software engineering. And there are distinctions here. For example, different categories of development. Most of us live in what I would call project-oriented code. And we are champions in the humanities if we can build a package that does something. And so you build, I spent years building a system that can analyze the Greek and Latin morphology. And it did, I think it's been used a long time. It did a pretty good job. I dealt with a whole bunch of phenomena. God help you if you look at the code I wrote. People have, and I'm always embarrassed. But this is a project-oriented code. Get it to work. Research code. This is a little higher level. This is your computer scientist, and you write your code. And maybe you put it in GitHub, but the purpose is to run an experiment and test 2 versions of an algorithm against the gold standard and come up with something measured. But again, research code is something you built once for a particular purpose. Maybe you took real programming courses. They taught you how to comment your code and structure your code, that other people might be able to read it. But reusable code is something we desperately need if we're going to go forward. And that's a lot harder than making it work. I haven't gotten, maybe somebody in software engineering here has numbers for this. The old figure is Fred Brooks from the 1970s, that reusable code costs three times as good single-purpose code. So that means you spend a year building something and it works, and you think you're done, and you got 3 years before you're finished, 3 more years before you're finished. So people make so much money in software engineering because they spend so much time documenting their code and restructuring it and doing it elegantly. Hard to do. And then finally, the big question, infrastructure. I don't know what infrastructure is. Most people, infrastructure seems to be a buzzword to get money from agencies. So you say, we're doing infrastructure and we need money. And I don't have a good definition. But my functioning operative definition is infrastructure is when somebody else besides you runs your digital services and you can take them for granted. Infrastructure is when you can drop dead, as we all will sooner or later, and your work will be supported. Okay, so these are the things we need to think about. And I'll just finish by saying, what is the role of, let me skip through a bunch of slides here and just say, yeah, I have a lot of slides, but what about Austria? What's cool about Austria? A lot of things are cool about Austria, not just the various nice things I get to eat and so on, and the wine and other cool things, and not being German. But here is one of my projects, which would be, I'm working on this guy, famous for having more or less popularized the idea that Greek and Latin were related to Sanskrit and freaking everybody out and challenging people with their sense of who they were. But his first works were on Persian, a French translation of a Persian history that the king of Denmark sort of pushed him, bullied him into producing, and he wrote it in French. This is an Englishman for the king of Denmark. It's like the 18th century. I love it. He was 24 years old when he did this. Then there's his grammar of the Persian language, which was a bestseller, supposedly. I haven't seen the figures. But it was popular because, while the British were moving into India. And then the third book before he was 26, which was 600 or 400 pages in Latin, talking about Greek, Latin, Hebrew, Arabic, and Persian poetry, and about why Persian and Arabic poetry were just as important as Greek and Latin, expanding the European mindset. This guy is an issue because it's English, and he's tied to British imperial power. But he is building, and this is my XML file. We're going to turn this into a digital edition, and I could spend a long time talking about it. But I just want to contrast it with things that he built on. And this is a grammar of Turkish, Arabic, and Persian, produced by Francis Messiaen, Meninsky, who was French, and then he went to Poland and learned Polish and ended up here in Vienna for the last 30 years of his life, and published this grammar at a very interesting time, as those of you who are Austrian know. Anyone who goes to the museums here knows. He also was the first person to publish, as far as we could tell, Persian poetry in Europe, and to translate it into a European language. He translated it into Latin. And he provided essentially the same dense linguistic annotation and glossing that we want to provide for Greek and Latin. He provided it for Hafez. But he, of course, as those of you who are Austrian learned in school, grew up knowing, he is not looking at Ottoman Turkish and Arabic and Persian as an Englishman who's in John Company and is going to go try and take over some more power from the Maharajas, he's looking at it as a person who had the Sultan's army coming on a not very friendly visit. It's a very different relationship. It's a piece of scholarship produced by a person who went deep into Eastern Europe, learned Polish, one of the languages no one learns, as well as Turkish, Arabic, and Persian. So this is a part of the cultural heritage of Austria that is really powerful. Do I write a proposal to the DFG to work on this? No, I shouldn't do that. This is an Austrian thing. If you're going to go national on me. So I just finished by saying, what is the role? What are the things that one can do here in Austria that is distinctive, that can contribute to this larger view of a global philology? I have a lot of ideas. I think that we all are European. We all belong to nation states. How do we balance these things together? And we all belong to the world. How does our work on these ancient languages contribute in both locally, nationally, in Europe, and in the world to advance the world of which we are a part? And I think on that question, I will shut up. Thank you very much.